The stage rattled into Monticello, Utah on a scorching afternoon in August of 1882, carrying a woman who hadn't uttered a single word since leaving St. Louis 3 weeks prior. And Henry Mackenzie knew the moment he saw her pale, exhausted face through the dusty window that his carefully planned future had just become infinitely more complicated. Henry stood outside the general store, his worn hat shading his eyes from the relentless sun, watching as the driver climbed down and opened the coach door. The other passengers emerged first, stretching their cramped limbs and complaining about the heat, the dust, the miserable journey across the frontier. Then she appeared, moving slowly, carefully, as though each step required conscious thought. Wilhelmina Vaughn, according to the letters they'd exchanged over 6 months, though the woman before him seemed like a stranger inhabiting the body of the person whose elegant handwriting had filled him with such hope. She wore a dark gray traveling dress that had seen better days, covered in the dust of countless miles. Her auburn hair was pulled back severely, revealing a face that might have been beautiful if not for the hollow emptiness in her hazel eyes. She clutched a single carpet bag as though it contained everything she owned, which Henry suspected it probably did. When their eyes met, he saw something flicker there. Recognition, perhaps, or maybe fear. He couldn't tell which, and that worried him more than he wanted to admit. "Miss Vaughn?" He stepped forward, removing his hat. "I'm Henry Mackenzie." She looked at him for a long moment, her lips parting slightly as though she might speak, but no sound emerged. Instead, she simply nodded once, a brief dip of her chin that could have meant anything or nothing at all. Henry waited, uncertain. The stage driver tossed down a small trunk that landed with a heavy thud in the red dust of the street. "That's all of it," the man called. "Good luck to you both." There was something ominous in those words, something that made Henry's stomach tighten. He picked up the trunk, surprised by its weight, and gestured toward where his wagon waited. "My ranch is about 5 miles outside of town. It's not much, but it's honest land, and I've worked hard to make it a proper home." Wilhelmina followed him without speaking, her footsteps soft in the dirt. She moved like a ghost, Henry thought, there but not quite present. He loaded her belongings into the wagon bed and helped her onto the seat, his hand steadying her elbow. She flinched slightly at the contact, and he immediately released her, disturbed by her reaction. The ride to the ranch passed in absolute silence. Henry tried several times to make conversation, pointing out landmarks, talking about the land, the cattle, the neighbors who lived 10 miles to the west. Wilhelmina sat rigidly beside him, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on some distant point on the horizon. She didn't acknowledge his words with so much as a glance, and eventually Henry fell silent too. The only sounds the creak of the wagon wheels and the steady clip of the horses' hooves. The Mackenzie ranch appeared as they crested a low rise, a modest homestead nestled in a valley with the La Salle Mountains rising purple and majestic in the distance. Henry had built the house himself over 3 years, expanding it from a 1-room cabin to a proper 4-room home with a covered porch and glass windows he'd hauled all the way from Salt Lake City. The barn stood solid and square, freshly painted red last spring. Cattle grazed in the pastures beyond, and chickens scratched in the yard near the garden he'd planted and carefully tended, hoping to impress his bride. "Here we are," Henry said, pulling the wagon to a stop near the porch. "Home." Wilhelmina looked at the house for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she climbed down from the wagon before Henry could help her and stood waiting with her hands clasped, still silent. Henry carried her trunk inside, showing her to the bedroom he'd prepared. He'd given her the larger of the two, the one with the window facing east to catch the morning sun. His own belongings he'd moved to the smaller room, not wanting to presume anything despite their arrangement. "This is your room," he said, setting the trunk at the foot of the bed. "I'll be across the hall. The kitchen is through there, and the main room is where we just came through. Make yourself at home, please." She nodded again, that same brief acknowledgement, and Henry retreated, closing the door behind him to give her privacy. He stood in the hallway for a moment, utterly at a loss. In all his imaginings of this day, he'd never pictured this. He'd expected awkwardness, certainly, the natural discomfort of two strangers coming together in such an unconventional arrangement. But he'd also expected conversation, getting to know each other, the tentative first steps toward building something real. This silence felt like a wall he couldn't see how to breach. That evening, Henry prepared dinner, a simple meal of beef stew and fresh bread he'd baked that morning in nervous anticipation. He set the table carefully, using the nice plates his mother had given him before she passed, and called gently through Wilhelmina's door that supper was ready. She emerged after a few minutes, having changed into a simple blue cotton dress and tidied her hair. She looked slightly less exhausted, but no more inclined to speak. They sat across from each other at the small table, and Henry served the stew, filling both their bowls. "I hope you like it," he said. "I'm not the finest cook, but I manage well enough." Wilhelmina picked up her spoon and ate slowly, mechanically. She didn't look at him, didn't react to the food at all. Henry watched her, trying to understand what had happened to this woman. Her letters had been warm, thoughtful, filled with observations about the world and questions about his life. She'd written about her love of reading, her skill with a needle, her desire for a fresh start in the West. The woman before him seemed incapable of any of those things. "The journey must have been hard," Henry ventured after a while. 3 weeks on the stage is enough to wear anyone down. You should rest. Take all the time you need to recover." No response. She continued eating, each spoonful precise and measured. "I thought tomorrow I could show you around the place properly, introduce you to the animals, show you the garden. There's a creek not far from here, real pretty spot with cottonwoods. Peaceful. Still nothing." Henry felt frustration beginning to build beneath his concern. He set down his spoon. "Miss Vaughn, Wilhelmina, I need to know if something's wrong. If you've changed your mind about this arrangement, I understand. I won't hold you to anything, but I need to know." She looked up at him then, really looked at him for the first time. Her eyes were filled with such pain that Henry felt his breath catch. Her mouth opened, her throat worked as though she were trying to form words, but nothing came out. Tears began to slip down her cheeks, silent and steady. She stood abruptly, nearly knocking over her chair, and fled to her room. The door closed softly behind her. Henry sat alone at the table, the stew growing cold, and wondered what in God's name he'd gotten himself into. The next morning, Wilhelmina emerged from her room early. Henry was already up, having slept poorly, and was making coffee when she appeared in the kitchen doorway. She dressed in a practical work dress, her hair braided simply. Without a word, she began helping with breakfast, finding the eggs, the flour, moving around the kitchen with quiet efficiency. Henry watched, uncertain whether to be encouraged or more worried. "Thank you," he said when she placed a plate of fried eggs and biscuits before him. She nodded and sat with her own plate, eating in that same silent, mechanical way. Over the following days, a strange routine developed. Wilhelmina worked tirelessly around the house and yard, cleaning, cooking, mending, tending the garden. She moved through her tasks with an almost desperate energy, as though staying busy could keep something at bay. Henry tried repeatedly to engage her in conversation, to draw her out, but she remained locked in her silence. She would nod or shake her head occasionally to direct questions, but never spoke. On the third day, Henry rode into town for supplies and stopped by the doctor's office. Doc Patterson had been in Monticello since the town's founding in 1879 and had seen just about everything the frontier could throw at a person. "She doesn't speak at all?" the doctor asked, leaning back in his chair. "Not a word. She cries sometimes when she thinks I can't hear, but no speech. Her letters were perfectly normal, well written even." "Something happened, Doc. Something bad." "Could be shock," Patterson said thoughtfully. "Seen it in soldiers sometimes after bad battles. Mind just shuts down certain functions to protect itself. Or could be something physical, damage to the throat or vocal cords, though you'd likely see other signs of injury. Has she been eating?" "Yes, and working. Too much, honestly. She's wearing herself out." "Then my guess is it's the mind, not the body. Whatever she experienced, she's not ready to talk about it. Might never be. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Henry had been asking himself the same thing. I don't know. Sending her back seems cruel, but keeping her here when she's clearly suffering doesn't seem right either. Give her time, the doctor advised. Let her know she's safe. Sometimes that's all a person needs to start healing. Henry returned to the ranch with the doctor's words echoing in his mind. He found Wilhelmina in the garden viciously attacking the weeds between the vegetable rows. Her hands were raw despite the gloves she wore, her face flushed with heat and exertion. He knelt beside her, gently taking the hoe from her grip. You're going to hurt yourself, he said softly. The weeds aren't going anywhere. Let's take a break. She resisted for a moment, then released the tool and sat back on her heels, breathing hard. Henry noticed fresh blisters on her palms and felt his heart clench. Come on, he said, offering his hand. Let's get those hands taken care of. He led her to the house and sat her at the kitchen table, bringing water and clean cloth and the tin of salve his mother had taught him to make from beeswax and herbs. Carefully, he cleaned her hands and applied the salve, wrapping the worst of the blisters with gentle strips of cloth. Wilhelmina watched his hands as he worked, and Henry was acutely aware of how close she was. The faint scent of lavender that clung to her despite the hard work, the way the afternoon light caught the red in her hair. I know you can't or won't tell me what happened, he said quietly, not looking up from his work, and that's your right. But I want you to know something. You're safe here. Whatever you're running from, whatever you're afraid of, it can't touch you on this land. I won't let it, and I won't push you. When you're ready to talk, if you're ever ready, I'll listen. Until then, I'll wait. He felt her hand tremble in his, saw a tear splash onto the table between them. But still, she said nothing. That night, Henry was awakened by screaming. He bolted from his bed and ran to Wilhelmina's room, throwing open the door to find her thrashing in the sheets, caught in the grip of a nightmare. Without thinking, he crossed to the bed and gripped her shoulders gently but firmly. Wilhelmina, wake up. You're safe. Wake up. Her eyes flew open, wild and unseeing for a moment. Then she focused on his face and seemed to collapse inward, great gasping sobs shaking her entire body. Henry did the only thing he could think of. He gathered her into his arms and held her, one hand stroking her hair, murmuring nonsense comfort words the way his mother used to do when he was small and afraid of the dark. She clung to him, her fists twisted in his nightshirt, crying so hard he thought she might break apart. Henry held her through it all, his own eyes stinging with sympathetic tears. Whatever had been done to this woman, it was enough to shatter her. The knowledge made him furious at people he'd never met, at circumstances he couldn't change. Eventually the storm passed. Wilhelmina's sobs quieted to hiccups, then to shaky breathing. She didn't pull away, though, and Henry didn't release her. They sat there in the darkness, two broken people holding each other together. I'm sorry, Henry whispered. I'm so sorry for whatever was done to you. He felt her nod against his chest, felt her grip on his shirt tighten for just a moment, as though in acknowledgement or thanks. Then carefully she pulled back. Her face was blotchy and swollen from crying, her eyes red-rimmed. She looked at him with something that might have been gratitude or trust or simply exhaustion. Henry stood, helping her settle back against the pillows. Try to rest. I'll leave the door open. If you need anything, just knock on the wall. I'll hear you. She nodded, and he returned to his own room, but sleep was a long time coming. The next morning marked a subtle shift. Wilhelmina still didn't speak, but she seemed less brittle, less desperate in her work. When Henry suggested a walk to the creek after lunch, she agreed with a small nod and even fetched her shawl without being prompted. They walked side by side through the pasture, Henry pointing out the cattle, telling her their stories. He'd named most of them, which he admitted was probably foolish given their eventual fate, but he'd never been able to help himself. That old girl there, that's Buttercup. I know, terrible name for a cow. But she arrived in spring when the wildflowers were blooming, and it seemed to fit. She's the matriarch of the herd, keeps the others in line. And that big fellow is Duke. He thinks he's something special, and I suppose he's earned the right. Best bull for 3 counties. The creek bubbled over smooth stones, the water clear and cold even in the August heat. Cottonwoods provided shade, their leaves whispering in the breeze. Henry sat on a flat rock near the water's edge, and Wilhelmina settled nearby, tucking her skirt around her legs. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the water flow, listening to the birds call from the branches above. "I used to come here when I first arrived," Henry said, "when the work got overwhelming and I wondered what the hell I was doing trying to carve a life out of this hard land. Something about moving water always calmed me, made me remember that things keep flowing, keep moving forward, even when it feels like you're stuck in one place." Wilhelmina looked at him, really looked at him, and Henry saw recognition in her eyes, understanding. She reached out slowly and placed her hand over his where it rested on the rock between them. It was the first time she'd initiated contact, and Henry felt the significance of it settle over him like a weight and a gift all at once. "We're going to be all right," he said, turning his hand to clasp hers gently. "Both of us, however long it takes." She squeezed his hand, and though she didn't smile, something in her expression softened. On the 5th day, Henry was in the barn, repairing a stall door when Wilhelmina appeared with a basket containing lunch. She'd packed bread and cheese and apples, along with a jar of cold water from the well. They sat together on hay bales, eating and watching the barn cats chase mice through the shadows. Henry told her about his plans to expand the herd next spring, about maybe getting some horses to break and sell, diversifying beyond just cattle. "I'm good with horses," he said. "My father taught me before he died. It was the one thing we shared, him and me. He wasn't an easy man, but put him with a horse and he became someone different, patient, gentle. I try to remember that version of him." Wilhelmina listened intently, her eyes on his face. Henry found himself talking more than he had in months, maybe years. There was something about her silent attention that made confession easy, that invited honesty. "I never thought I'd end up here," he admitted. "I had plans once back in Missouri. Was going to take over my uncle's freight business, marry a girl named Sarah who lived 3 farms over. But then the fever came through, took my parents and Sarah's whole family. She went east to live with relatives, and I couldn't stay in that place anymore, too many ghosts. So I came west, kept coming until I found land that felt right. Built this place from nothing. And it's good, don't misunderstand me. I'm proud of what I've done, but it's been lonely." He looked at her, trying to read her expression. "I don't want you to feel obligated. What we agreed to in letters, that was before whatever happened to you. I meant what I said. You're safe here, for as long as you need, without expectations." Wilhelmina set down her half-eaten apple and stood. For a moment, Henry thought she was leaving, perhaps upset by his words. Instead, she crossed to where he sat and very deliberately placed her hand on his cheek. Her palm was cool and slightly rough from work. She held his gaze for a long moment, and Henry saw tears gathering in her eyes, but not sad tears this time. Grateful ones. Then she leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to his forehead before turning and walking back to the house, leaving Henry sitting stunned in the barn, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Henry worked up the courage to take her hand. She let him, her fingers intertwining with his naturally, as though they'd been doing this for years instead of days. They sat like that until full dark, not speaking because they didn't need to, and Henry felt something that might have been hope beginning to grow in his chest. On the 6th day, neighbors arrived unexpectedly. Thomas and Martha Reynolds lived on the nearest ranch, 10 miles west toward the small settlement of Verdure. They pulled up in their wagon around mid-morning, bringing fresh eggs and a pot of Martha's famous chili as a welcome gift for the new bride. Henry had mentioned his arrangement to Thomas a few months back, and apparently word had spread. Martha was a round, cheerful woman in her 50s with graying hair and a smile that could light up a room. She swept onto the porch like a whirlwind, embracing Henry and then reaching for Wilhelmina, who stood frozen in the doorway. "Oh, honey, let me look at you. My goodness, you're a pretty thing. Even if you do look like you've been through the ringer. That journey will take it out of you, won't it? I remember when Thomas and I first came out here in '68, I thought I'd never recover, thought every bone in my body had been rattled loose." She kept up a steady stream of chatter, herding them all into the house, setting out the food, making herself at home in Henry's kitchen, while Thomas stood by grinning and shaking his head at his wife's energy. Henry tried to catch Martha's eye to warn her somehow about Wilhelmina's silence, but there was no stopping the woman once she got going. "Now you must tell me all about yourself, dear. Where are you from? Do you have family back east? What made you decide to come all the way out to this God-forsaken corner of Utah? Not that it isn't beautiful in its own way, but Lord knows it's not for everyone." Wilhelmina looked helplessly at Henry. He stepped forward, putting a gentle hand on Martha's arm. "Martha, there's something you should know. Wilhelmina isn't speaking right now. Hasn't said a word since she arrived." Martha stopped mid-sentence, her mouth forming a small O of surprise. Then her expression shifted to one of immediate compassion. "Oh, honey," she said softly, reaching out to take Wilhelmina's hand. "Oh, you poor dear. Something bad happened, didn't it?" Wilhelmina's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "Well, that's all right then," Martha said firmly. "You don't need to speak to be welcome here. Actions count for more than words most days anyway. Thomas, stop standing there like a lump and help Henry bring in the rest of what we brought." The men retreated to the wagon, and Henry heard Thomas ask quietly, "What do you think happened?" "I don't know," Henry replied, "and I don't think it's our business unless she decides to tell us. All I know is she's here now, and she's safe." Thomas nodded slowly. He was a man of few words himself, which was probably how he survived being married to Martha. "You're a good man, Henry. She's lucky to have found you." Inside, Martha had settled Wilhelmina at the table and was pouring coffee, still talking but in a softer, more soothing way. "I had a cousin once, sweet girl named Elizabeth, who stopped speaking after her first husband beat her nearly to death. Took her 2 years to find her voice again, but she did eventually. Married a good man the second time around, had 3 beautiful children. Sometimes the mind needs time to heal, just like the body. Ain't nothing wrong with that." Henry saw Wilhelmina's shoulders relax slightly, saw something like relief cross her face. Having someone else acknowledge her silence, accept it without judgment, seemed to ease some burden she'd been carrying. The Reynolds stayed for lunch, Martha doing enough talking for all 4 of them, telling stories about the early days of settling in the area, the struggles and triumphs, the community that had slowly grown in this hard land. By the time they left, pressing promises from Henry to bring Wilhelmina for dinner soon, Wilhelmina seemed lighter somehow, less weighed down. That night, after the dishes were done, she pulled out a piece of paper and a pencil and began to write. Henry watched as she filled the page with careful script, then held it out to him. "Thank you for being patient with me. Thank you for being kind. I am sorry I cannot yet speak. I want to. I am trying. Please know that I am grateful to be here." Henry read the words twice, then looked up at her. "You don't need to apologize, and you don't need to force anything. I meant what I said. I'll wait." She wrote again. "You are a good man, Henry Mackenzie, better than I had any right to hope for." "I'm just doing what's right," he said, uncomfortable with the praise. She shook her head and wrote once more, "No, you are doing more than that. You are giving me a reason to heal." Henry felt his throat tighten with emotion. He reached across the table and took her hand. "Then heal. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." On the 7th morning, Henry woke to the smell of bacon frying and coffee brewing. He dressed quickly and came into the kitchen to find Wilhelmina already preparing breakfast, humming softly to herself. The sound stopped him in his tracks. It was the first noise beyond crying that he'd heard her make, a gentle melodic humming that spoke of returning life. She turned and saw him standing there, and for the first time since her arrival, she smiled. It was a small smile, tentative and fragile, but real. Henry felt it hit him square in the chest, stealing his breath. "Good morning," he managed. She nodded, still smiling, and returned to the stove. They ate breakfast together, the morning light streaming through the windows, warming the kitchen. Henry told her about his plans for the day, checking fence lines in the north pasture, maybe riding into town if there was time. She listened and nodded, and when he stood to clear the plates, she stopped him with a hand on his arm. Their eyes met, and Henry felt the air between them charge with something electric. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he raised his hand and gently tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Her eyes fluttered closed at the touch, and he saw her throat work as she swallowed hard. "Wilhelmina," he said softly, "I know this isn't what either of us expected, but I want you to know something. I'm glad you're here. Silent or speaking, I'm glad." She opened her eyes, and the emotion he saw there nearly undid him. Gratitude and affection, and something deeper, something growing. She leaned forward and rested her forehead against his chest, and Henry wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. They stood like that for a long moment, and Henry thought maybe words weren't always necessary. Maybe some things could be communicated just fine through touch, through presence, through the simple act of standing together against whatever the world might throw at them. He rode out to check the fences, but found his mind wandering constantly back to the woman waiting at the house. When had this happened? When had his concern shifted to something more? He'd started this arrangement pragmatically, wanting a partner to help build a life, someone to share the burden and the rewards of frontier living. But somewhere in the silence of the past week, something real had begun to grow. He returned to find Wilhelmina sitting on the porch with a basket of mending, her needle flashing in the afternoon sun. She looked up as he approached, and again that small smile appeared. Henry dismounted and sat beside her, watching her work. "You're good at that," he observed. "Martha was right when she said your stitches were fine." Wilhelmina's smile widened slightly, pleased by the compliment. She finished the shirt she was working on and set it aside, then turned to face him more fully. She looked nervous, her hands twisting together in her lap. Henry waited, not pushing but hoping. She opened her mouth, closed it again. Tried once more. Her throat worked, her face tight with concentration and frustration. Henry reached out and took her hand, squeezing gently. "It's all right," he said. "Don't force it." But she shook her head, determined. She took a deep breath and tried again, and this time a sound emerged, rough and barely audible, but unmistakably a word. Henry. His name. She'd spoken his name. Henry felt tears spring to his eyes, felt his chest swell with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "I'm here," he said, his voice rough. "I'm right here." "Thank you," she whispered, the words painful and halting but clear. "Thank you for waiting." Then she was crying, and Henry was holding her, and she was speaking in fragmented bursts between sobs, words tumbling out like water from a broken dam. "My husband, my first husband, he died. Fever, I was alone, no money, nowhere to go. His brother, he said he'd help, said he'd take care of me, but he tried to force. I fought, I ran, stole money from his desk, enough for passage. But I was so scared he'd follow, so scared I'd made a mistake. And then you were so kind, so patient. I wanted to speak, but the words were locked inside, trapped. I thought I'd never find them again." "Shh," Henry soothed, stroking her hair. "You're safe now. He can't reach you here. I promise you're safe." "I know," she said, pulling back to look at him through tear-bright eyes. "I know that now. You showed me. You gave me time, gave me space, never demanded, never pushed. You gave me back myself." Henry cupped her face in his hands, wiping away tears with his thumbs. "I only did what any decent man would do." "No," Wilhelmina said firmly, her voice gaining strength. "Most men wouldn't have been so kind. Most would have sent me back or worse, but you waited. You waited until I was ready. I'd have waited longer if you needed it, Henry said honestly. Forever, if that's what it took. She made a small sound that was half laugh, half sob. I don't deserve you. We deserve each other, he corrected gently. Two people looking for a fresh start, for something real. Maybe we found it. Maybe we did, she agreed. And this time when she smiled, it reached her eyes. They sat together on the porch as the sun sank lower, and Wilhelmina talked. She told him about her life before, growing up in St. Louis, her marriage at 19 to a man who seemed kind but was weak in ways that mattered. She told him about the fever that swept through the city last spring, taking her husband along with hundreds of others. She spoke of her desperation, her vulnerability, and the predatory nature of her brother-in-law, who saw an opportunity in her grief. He cornered me one night, she said, her voice flat with the memory. Said I owed the family, owed him for taking me in after Marcus died. Said I could pay with my body or find myself on the streets. I barely got away, took what money I could find and ran. I'd seen your advertisement in the paper months before, had even written to you at Marcus's encouragement. When your response came to the house after he died, I saw it as a sign. A way out. I'm sorry you went through that, Henry said quietly, but I'm grateful you found your way here. I am too, Wilhelmina said, though I worried you'd think me mad or damaged, staying silent for so long. I thought you were hurting, Henry said, and I wanted to help if I could, that's all. She leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. You did help. You are helping. Just being you, being patient, being kind. It's more than I could have hoped for. As darkness fell, they went inside, and Wilhelmina cooked dinner while telling him stories about her childhood, about her mother who died when she was young and her father who did his best raising her alone. Henry listened, soaking in every word, learning the woman behind the silence. Over the following weeks, Wilhelmina bloomed like a desert flower after rain. Her voice grew stronger daily, and with it her confidence. She threw herself into life on the ranch with enthusiasm, learning everything Henry could teach her about the cattle, the land, the rhythm of frontier life. She proved remarkably capable, unafraid of hard work or getting dirty. She also proved to have a sharp wit and a quick laugh that Henry found himself working to provoke. They developed an easy partnership, working side by side during the day and spending evenings on the porch talking until the stars came out. Henry found himself falling in love, really truly falling in a way he hadn't thought possible. The question of their marriage hung unspoken between them. They'd agreed to it in letters, but so much had changed. Henry didn't want to pressure her, didn't want her to feel obligated, but he also couldn't deny what he felt anymore. One evening in late September, with autumn painting the mountains in brilliant colors, Henry finally gathered his courage. They were sitting by the creek, watching the water flow in the fading light, when he turned to her. Wilhelmina, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly, no matter what. She looked at him curious, but unafraid. All right. Do you want to stay here? Not as an obligation or because you have nowhere else to go, but because you want to, because this feels right to you. She was quiet for a moment, considering. Then she said, Yes, I want to stay. This place, this life, you, Henry, it all feels right in a way nothing else ever has. I feel like I can breathe here, like I can be myself without fear or judgment. So yes, I want to stay. Relief flooded through Henry. Good, that's good, because I've gone and fallen in love with you, and I was hoping you might feel something similar. Her eyes widened, then softened. You love me? Completely, he said simply. Didn't mean for it to happen so fast, but there it is. I love your strength, your resilience, your kindness. I love the way you sing while you cook, and the way you talk to the chickens like they're your friends. I love that you can keep up with me working cattle and aren't afraid to get your hands dirty. I love everything about you. Henry, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I love you too. I think I started falling that first night when you held me through the nightmare and didn't ask for anything in return. And I kept falling every day after, watching you be patient and kind and good. I love you so much it scares me sometimes." "Don't be scared," Henry said, taking her hands. "We're in this together now." "Together," she repeated, smiling. "I like the sound of that." He kissed her then, soft and sweet, and Wilhelmina kissed him back with a fervor that made his heart race. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, she laughed, the sound pure and joyful. "So," she said, "when should we actually get married? I mean properly, with a preacher and witnesses?" "How about this Sunday? It's such," Henry suggested. "We can ride into town, have Reverend Michaels perform the ceremony. Ask the Reynolds to stand up with us." "This Sunday," Wilhelmina agreed, her smile brilliant in the twilight. "I'll finally become Mrs. Mackenzie for real." "You've been her in my heart for weeks now," Henry admitted. "This just makes it official." They were married that Sunday in the small church in Monticello, with Martha crying happy tears and Thomas looking pleased, and half the town turning out because news of the formerly silent bride had spread and everyone wanted to see her speak her vows. Wilhelmina wore a simple dress she'd sewn herself from cream-colored fabric Henry bought in town, with wildflowers in her hair that Martha had gathered that morning. When Reverend Michaels asked if she took Henry to be her lawfully wedded husband, Wilhelmina's voice rang out clear and strong. "I do. With all my heart, I do." Henry slipped a gold band on her finger, one that had been his mother's, and when he kissed his bride, the small congregation erupted in applause. Martha insisted on hosting a celebration dinner at their ranch, and what started as a simple meal turned into an impromptu dance with Thomas pulling out his fiddle and playing while couples swirled in the yard under the stars. Henry held Wilhelmina close as they danced, marveling at how much had changed in just over a month. "Happy?" he asked. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she replied. "You saved me, Henry. You gave me time to save myself, and that's the greatest gift anyone could have given." "You saved me too," he said honestly. "I didn't realize how lonely I was until you arrived, how much I needed someone to share this life with, to make it meaningful." "We saved each other then," she said, rising on her toes to kiss him, "and we'll keep saving each other every day for the rest of our lives." That night, in the house that was now truly theirs, Henry and Wilhelmina became husband and wife in every sense. They came together with tenderness and passion, learning each other's bodies the way they'd been learning each other's hearts. Afterward, lying wrapped in each other's arms, Wilhelmina traced patterns on Henry's chest. "Tell me something," she said softly. "That first week, when I couldn't speak, what did you think was going to happen? Did you think I'd ever talk again?" Henry considered the question. "Honestly, I didn't know, but I decided it didn't matter. Speaking or silent, I was going to stand by you. You needed help, needed safety, and I could provide that. The rest we'd figure out as we went." "What did I do to deserve you?" she wondered. "You survived," Henry said simply. "You survived something terrible and kept going. That takes more strength than most people have. I admired that from the moment I saw you step off that stage, even before I knew the details." She kissed his shoulder. "I want to write to my brother-in-law," she said after a moment. "Tell him I'm married, that I'm beyond his reach now. Close that chapter for good." "We can do that," Henry agreed, "though I'd like to add my own message to that letter, make it clear what will happen if he ever tries to bother you again." Wilhelmina laughed. "My fierce protector." "Always," he promised. The seasons turned, autumn giving way to winter. The first snow came in November, transforming the ranch into something magical. Wilhelmina had never experienced a frontier winter before and approached it with a mixture of wonder and trepidation. Henry taught her how to prepare, how to stock supplies and winterize the buildings. They worked together to lay in firewood, preserve food, and make sure the animals were ready for the cold months ahead. On Christmas Eve, they sat before the fireplace in the main room, Wilhelmina reading aloud from a book of poetry while Henry whittled, making her a set of wooden spoons for the kitchen. Outside, snow fell thick and soft, muffling all sound. It felt like they were the only two people in the world, safe and warm in their little sanctuary. "Henry?" Wilhelmina said, setting down her book. "Hmm?" "I'm pregnant." His hand stilled, the knife hovering over the half-formed spoon. "What?" "I'm pregnant," she repeated, nervous and excited all at once. "About 2 months along, I think. Are you happy?" Henry set down his work and crossed to her, pulling her into his arms. "Happy?" "I'm overjoyed. A baby, our baby. When?" "Late spring, early summer if my calculations are right." He kissed her thoroughly, then dropped to his knees and placed his hands gently on her still, flat stomach. "Hello in there, little one. I'm your papa, and I already love you more than I thought possible." Wilhelmina laughed, running her fingers through his hair. "We're going to be parents." "We're going to be parents," Henry agreed, awed by the concept. "We're going to need to add on to the house, make a proper nursery, and we'll need a cradle. I can build one, like my father built for me." They spent the rest of the evening making plans, dreaming about the future, about the child who would join them, the baby who would be born into a home filled with love, who would grow up on this land they were building together. Winter passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Martha was delighted by the news and arrived frequently with gifts she'd made, tiny clothes and blankets, offering advice and stories about her own children, now grown and scattered across the West. The ranch became a cocoon, insulated from the outside world by snow and cold, giving Henry and Wilhelmina time to simply be together, to strengthen the bonds between them. Spring arrived with a rush of meltwater and new growth, and Wilhelmina's belly swelled with their child. She remained active despite Henry's nervous hovering, insisting that she felt fine and work was good for both her and the baby. They planted the garden together, Wilhelmina directing from a chair when Henry insisted she rest, and the future stretched before them bright and full of promise. In early June, on a warm afternoon when the air smelled of sage and wildflowers, Wilhelmina's labor began. Henry rode hard for Martha, who arrived with her birthing kit and calm, no-nonsense attitude. She shooed Henry out of the bedroom, telling him to make himself useful by boiling water and staying out of the way. The hours stretched endlessly. Henry paced the main room, listening to Wilhelmina's cries, feeling helpless and terrified. When Martha finally emerged, tired but smiling, Henry nearly collapsed with relief. "You have a son," she announced, "a big, healthy boy with a powerful set of lungs on him." Henry rushed past her into the bedroom. Wilhelmina lay propped against the pillows, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in one of Martha's quilts. She looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. "Look what we made," she said softly. Henry approached slowly, reverent, and looked down at his son. The baby had a shock of dark hair, and his eyes were scrunched shut, his little face red and wrinkled. He was the most beautiful thing Henry had ever seen. "Can I hold him?" he asked. Wilhelmina carefully transferred the baby to his arms, and Henry stood frozen, afraid to move, afraid to breathe wrong. His son, their son, a whole new person, a whole new life, beginning right here in this room. "What should we name him?" Wilhelmina asked. They'd discussed names endlessly over the winter, but never settled on one. Now, looking at the tiny face, Henry knew. "William," he said, "after my father. His good parts anyway. William Marcus for both our fathers." "William Marcus Mackenzie," Wilhelmina said, testing the name. "I like it. Welcome to the world, William. You have no idea how loved you are." The baby yawned, a tiny pink mouth opening wide, and Henry felt his heart expand to accommodate this new, overwhelming love. He carefully returned William to Wilhelmina's arms and climbed onto the bed beside them, wrapping them both in his embrace. "Thank you," he said into Wilhelmina's hair. "Thank you for this, for him, for everything." "Thank you," she replied, "for being patient, for waiting, for giving me the time and space to heal, for loving me, for this life? They stayed like that, the three of them, as the afternoon sun painted the room in shades of gold, the beginning of their family complete and perfect. William proved to be an easy baby, which Martha declared was a blessing for first-time parents. He nursed well, slept reasonably, and seemed content to watch the world from his mother's arms or the cradle Henry had painstakingly crafted. Henry discovered depths of tenderness he hadn't known he possessed, spending hours holding his son, telling him stories about the ranch, about the land, about the life that awaited him. Wilhelmina recovered quickly from the birth and was soon back to her usual energetic self, though Henry tried his best to ensure she didn't overdo it. They found a new rhythm, incorporating William into their daily routines, taking turns with him so both could still contribute to running the ranch. That summer was one of the happiest of Henry's life. The cattle thrived. The garden produced abundantly, and his family was healthy and whole. On warm evenings they would sit on the porch, William sleeping in Wilhelmina's arms while Henry played a harmonica he'd unearthed from his belongings. The music drifted across the valley, mingling with the crickets and the distant lowing of cattle. "Do you ever think about that first week?" Wilhelmina asked one such evening. "When I couldn't speak?" "Sometimes," Henry admitted. "It feels like a lifetime ago now." "It does, doesn't it?" She looked down at William's sleeping face. "I was so broken then, so lost. And you just waited. You gave me exactly what I needed without even knowing what that was. I figured if our positions were reversed, I'd want someone to be patient with me, to give me time to find my footing again." "Most people wouldn't have," Wilhelmina said. "They'd have sent me back, or demanded I fulfill my obligations regardless of my state. But you saw me as a person first, not just as a mail-order bride or a convenience." Henry reached over and took her free hand. "You were never just anything to me. From the moment I saw you, you were important, worth protecting, worth waiting for." "I love you," she said simply, "more than I thought it was possible to love another person." "I love you too," Henry replied. "Both of you. My whole world is right here on this porch." As William grew, so did the ranch. Henry made good on his plan to diversify into horses, buying a few promising young horses from a breeder near Moab and beginning the patient work of training them. Wilhelmina proved to have a natural way with the animals, and they worked together, building something larger than either had imagined. The community around Monticello continued to grow, and the Mackenzies became an integral part of it. They attended church regularly, participated in town gatherings, and built friendships that would last decades. Their story, how the silent bride found her voice with the patient cowboy, became something of a legend in the area, a testament to the power of kindness and the strength of love. When William was 2, Wilhelmina became pregnant again. This time she carried twins, which came as a shock when Doc Patterson made his examination. Henry was terrified at the prospect of 2 babies at once, but Wilhelmina took it in stride, already planning how to manage double the work and double the joy. The twins, a boy and a girl, they named Jacob Henry and Sarah Rose, arrived in the spring of 1885, healthy and squalling. William, now a toddling terror, was fascinated by his new siblings, wanting to help with everything and frequently getting underfoot in his enthusiasm. The house rang with noise and laughter, so different from the silent, lonely place it had been just 3 years before. Martha was a constant presence, helping with the babies and keeping an eye on William when Henry and Wilhelmina needed to focus on ranch work. Thomas pitched in too, helping Henry build the addition they desperately needed, 2 more bedrooms and a larger kitchen to accommodate their growing family. "Never thought I'd see the day this place felt small," Henry said one evening, surveying the construction. "Be careful what you wish for," Martha warned with a laugh. 3 children is just the beginning. Mark my words, there'll be more." She was right. Over the next decade, 3 more children joined the Mackenzie family. Each new addition was welcomed with joy, each birth bringing Henry to his knees with gratitude for the life he'd been given. Wilhelmina thrived as a mother, patient and loving, instilling in their children the values of kindness and resilience that had brought her through her darkest times. She told them stories about their father's patience, about how he'd waited for her to heal, teaching them the importance of compassion and understanding. Henry watched his children grow with pride and wonder. William became his right hand on the ranch, showing an early aptitude for cattle work. Jacob had his mother's way with horses, while Sarah proved to be a skilled gardener with a green thumb that could coax growth from the most stubborn plants. The younger children were still finding their paths, but each showed promise in their own ways. The ranch prospered under their stewardship. What had started as a modest cattle operation expanded into one of the most successful spreads in San Juan County. Henry and Wilhelmina were known for treating their hands fairly, for breeding quality stock, and for being pillars of the community. They gave generously to those in need, remembering their own struggles and determined to help others who faced hardship. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Henry took Wilhelmina back to the creek where they'd spent so many meaningful hours during those early days. The children were staying with the Reynolds, giving them a rare day alone. "Do you remember that first week?" Henry asked, pulling her down to sit on the same rock where he'd first taken her hand. "I'll never forget it," Wilhelmina said. "I was so scared, so broken, and you just calmly went about your life, making space for me, never pushing, never demanding. You saved my life, Henry. Not dramatically or all at once, but day by day, moment by moment, you gave me back myself." "You did the hard work," Henry said. "I just provided the safe space for it to happen." "You were patient," Wilhelmina said. "In a world that rarely is, you waited until I was ready to talk. That patience, that respect for my timing, it meant everything. It showed me I could trust you, that this was a man worth building a life with." Henry pulled her close, kissing her temple. "Best decision I ever made was putting that advertisement in the paper. Best luck I ever had was you answering it." "It wasn't luck," Wilhelmina said. "It was fate. We were meant to find each other, to save each other, to build this life together." They sat for a long time, watching the water flow, listening to the cottonwoods whisper overhead. 10 years, 6 children, countless challenges overcome, and Henry loved her more now than he had on their wedding day. The scared, silent woman who'd stepped off the stage had blossomed into a confident, capable partner, a loving mother, and the center of his entire world. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for taking a chance on a lonely cowboy with more hope than sense." "Thank you," she replied, "for being the kind of man worth taking a chance on, for showing me that not all men are cruel or selfish, for loving me, all of me, even the broken parts." "Especially the broken parts," Henry said. "They made you who you are. Strong, resilient, compassionate. I love every single piece of you." She turned in his arms and kissed him deep and sweet, a kiss that held 10 years of love and trust and partnership. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling. "Let's go home," Wilhelmina said. "Our children will be wondering where we are." "Home," Henry agreed. "I like the sound of that." They walked back to the ranch hand in hand, the same way they'd walked 1,000 times before and would walk 1,000 times more. The house came into view, expanded and improved, but still fundamentally the same place where a cowboy had waited for a silent bride to find her voice. Smoke curled from the chimney. The barn stood solid against the horizon, and cattle grazed peacefully in the pastures beyond. It was home. It was everything they'd built together. And it was perfect. The years continued to pass, bringing changes as all years do. The children grew, some staying to help run the ranch, others venturing out to make their own ways in the world. Henry and Wilhelmina watched them go with pride and a touch of sadness, knowing they'd raised them well, given them roots strong enough to support them wherever they might go. William, their firstborn, took over more of the daily ranch operations as Henry's back began to protest the hard work of cattle ranching. He married a local girl named Emma, bringing her to live in a house they built on the far side of the property, keeping the family close. Jacob became a renowned horse trainer, selling his stock across Utah and into Colorado. Sarah married a school teacher and moved to Blanding, returning frequently with her own growing family. The younger children followed their own paths as well, each finding their place in the world, but all staying connected to the land and family that had shaped them. The Mackenzie name became synonymous with integrity and hard work, with kindness and fair dealing. On their 25th anniversary, the entire family gathered at the ranch for a massive celebration. Children and grandchildren filled the house and yard, the sound of laughter and conversation echoing across the valley. Henry stood on the porch watching the chaos with deep satisfaction when Wilhelmina came to stand beside him. "Can you believe this?" she said, gesturing at the assembled multitude. "All of this came from that terrified woman who stepped off the stage 25 years ago, unable to speak." "I can believe it," Henry said. "I always knew you had this strength in you. I saw it even then beneath the fear and trauma. You just needed time and space to let it surface." "And you gave me that," she said, leaning against him. "You gave me everything, a home, a family, a life beyond anything I dared to dream." "We gave each other everything," Henry corrected. "You made this ranch a home. You filled it with love and laughter and life. Without you, it would have just been land and buildings. You made it matter." Martha Reynolds, now in her 80s but still spry, called everyone to attention. "I've known Henry and Wilhelmina since almost the beginning of their story," she announced, "and I want to tell you all that what they have is rare and precious. They built their love on patience and respect, on trust and understanding. They waited for each other, gave each other room to grow, and created something beautiful. That's what real love looks like." There were cheers and raised glasses, toasts and tears. William stood and spoke about his father's patience, about growing up knowing his mother had been given the time and space to heal, and how that lesson had shaped his own marriage. Sarah talked about her mother's strength, about the example she'd set for all of them. As the sun set and the party continued into the evening, Henry pulled Wilhelmina aside. "Dance with me?" he asked. "Always," she replied. They moved together to the music, Thomas's grandson now playing the fiddle, continuing the tradition. In Henry's arms, Wilhelmina felt the same way she had on their wedding night 25 years ago, safe and loved and home. "I'd do it all again," Henry said quietly. "Every moment, every challenge, every joy. I'd choose you every time." "Me too," Wilhelmina said. "Even the silent week, even the fear and pain that brought me here. It all led to this, to you, to us. I wouldn't change a thing." "Here's to the next 25 years, Henry said. "And the 25 after that," Wilhelmina added with a laugh. They danced until the stars came out, surrounded by family, rooted in the land they'd built together, secure in a love that had been forged in patience and strengthened through time. The mail-order bride who hadn't spoken for a week had found her voice, and the cowboy who'd waited had found his heart's home. Together they'd created something lasting, something real, something beautiful. And that, Henry thought as he held his wife close and looked out over the ranch, his children, his legacy, that was everything. The seasons continued their eternal dance, winter following autumn, spring chasing away winter's chill, summer bringing its heat and harvest. Henry and Wilhelmina grew older together, their hair graying, their steps slower, but their love never diminishing. If anything, it deepened with time, seasoned by decades of partnership and shared experience. They sat on the porch on warm evenings, grandchildren playing in the yard, and told stories about the old days, about the stage arriving with a silent woman, about a patient cowboy who decided to wait. The grandchildren never tired of hearing about those first 7 days, about how silence gave way to speech, how fear transformed into trust, how two strangers became partners and then soulmates. "Tell us again about the first time Grandma spoke," the youngest would beg, climbing into Henry's lap, and Henry would tell it, making sure they understood the important parts. "Your grandmother had been hurt, not in her body, but in her heart and mind. And when someone's been hurt like that, pushing them doesn't help. You have to give them space, give them time, let them know they're safe. That's what real love does. It waits." Wilhelmina would add her part, talking about Henry's kindness, his steady presence, the way he made her feel human again when she'd felt like nothing more than a scared animal. He never made me feel broken or wrong for needing time. He just accepted me as I was and trusted I'd heal in my own time. That's a gift more precious than any I could name. The lessons took root in the next generation, creating a legacy of compassion and patience that extended far beyond the ranch. The Mackenzie children and grandchildren were known for their kindness, for their willingness to help those in need, for understanding that everyone carries burdens and deserves grace. As Henry entered his 70s, his health began to fail. His heart, strong for so many years, began to weaken. Doc Patterson, retired now and replaced by his son, delivered the news gently but clearly. Henry had months, maybe a year if he was lucky, but certainly not much more. Henry took the news calmly, having lived a full life with few regrets. He gathered his family, told them plainly what was coming, and instructed them to take care of their mother and each other when he was gone. There were tears, protests, pleas for him to fight harder, but Henry was at peace. "I've had more than most men get," he told them. "A good life, meaningful work, and more love than I knew what to do with. I'm not afraid of what comes next." Wilhelmina took the news harder. After 50 years together, the thought of continuing without Henry seemed impossible, but she put on a brave face, determined to make his remaining time as comfortable and full of joy as possible. They moved through that final year with intention, savoring each moment. Henry insisted on one last ride to the creek, though it taxed his failing strength. They sat on their rock, the water flowing past just as it had 50 years before, eternal and unchanging. "Remember when I brought you here that first week?" Henry said, his voice weaker than it once was, but still warm. "I thought this place might help you the way it helped me. Turns out I was right." "You were right about a lot of things," Wilhelmina said, holding his hand tightly, "including me. You saw something worth waiting for when I couldn't see anything but fear and broken pieces." "You were never broken," Henry said, "just hurt. And hurt can heal, given time and care." "You gave me that time," Wilhelmina said, tears sliding down her weathered cheeks. "You gave me everything." "And you gave me a life worth living," Henry replied. "Every day with you was a gift. I want you to remember that when I'm gone. Every single day was a gift." Henry passed away on a spring morning, the windows open to let in the breeze that carried the scent of blooming wildflowers. Wilhelmina sat beside him, holding his hand. Their children gathered around. His last words were her name, spoken with such love that everyone in the room felt it like a physical presence. "Wilhelmina, my Wilhelmina." And then he was gone, slipping away as gently as he'd lived, leaving behind a legacy of love and patience that would echo through generations. Wilhelmina mourned deeply, but not hopelessly. She had decades of memories to sustain her, a family that surrounded her with love, and the knowledge that she'd been blessed beyond measure. She continued living at the ranch, tending her garden, spending time with grandchildren and great-grandchildren, telling stories about the man who changed her life by simply being patient. She lived another 15 years, her mind sharp even as her body failed. When she finally joined Henry, it was peacefully in the same bed where he'd died, surrounded by the same love. Her last words echoed his, a declaration that transcended death. "Henry, my Henry, I'm coming home." They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, the La Salle Mountains rising behind them, the land they'd built together spreading out before them. The headstones were simple, bearing their names and dates, but also an inscription chosen by their children. She found her voice. He waited. Together they found home. The ranch continued under William's stewardship, then passed to his children, and then to theirs. The Mackenzie name remained synonymous with integrity and compassion, the story of Henry and Wilhelmina becoming part of the fabric of Monticello's history. The house was preserved, expanded, but never fundamentally changed, a monument to what patience and love could build. And on warm spring evenings when the wind was right, locals swore they could hear music drifting across the valley from the old Mackenzie place, a harmonica playing gentle melodies, a woman's laughter, the sound of two souls who'd found each other against all odds and built something eternal. The story of the mail-order bride who didn't speak for a week and the cowboy who waited until she was ready to talk became legend. Passed down through generations, a reminder that sometimes the greatest act of love is simply giving someone the time and space they need to heal. That patience isn't passive but active, a conscious choice to trust in someone's strength even when they can't see it themselves. And in a world that often moved too fast, demanded too much, expected instant results and immediate gratification, the story of Henry and Wilhelmina stood as a testament to the power of waiting, of trusting, of loving someone enough to let them find their way back to themselves. Their great-great-grandchildren still lived on the land, still tended the cattle and horses, still planted gardens in the rich soil Henry had first turned over more than a century before. The creek still flowed, the cottonwoods still whispered, the mountains still stood purple and eternal against the sky. And somewhere in the fabric of that place, woven into the very soil and stone, the love of a patient cowboy and a silent bride who found her voice lived on, immortal and true, a promise that healing was possible, that love could overcome trauma, that waiting for someone to be ready was never time wasted, but rather time invested in something precious and rare. The end came not with drama, but with peace, as all good stories should. Henry and Wilhelmina's tale was one of ordinary people making extraordinary choices, of kindness in the face of suffering, of patience when urgency might have seemed more natural. It was a story of the American West, of hard land and harder work, but also of the gentle moments that made it all worthwhile. And as the sun set over Monticello, Utah, casting long shadows across the valley, the legacy of Henry Mackenzie and Wilhelmina Vaughn Mackenzie continued on, in the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who carried their names and their values, in the land they'd shaped and the love they'd built, in the story that would be told and retold as long as there were people who believed that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply wait for someone you love to be ready to speak.